Hi, everyone, and welcome to our expert panel today on inclusive hiring during an economic slowdown, actions from the experts. So let's begin. With inflation running wild and interest rates on the rise, it's possible that the global economy enters into a time of economic slowdown. When the economy cools, it can influence the labor market, and these changes can impact the way that organizations find and recruit talent. During this time, it is helpful to think about how the economy can influence an organization's ability to hire top talent and maybe provide the impetus for organizations to rethink their recruitment and selection strategy. For today's talk, I will give you a brief introduction to myself. I will then introduce the superstar lineup of panelists we have today. Then I'll enter into a discussion with questions that I have ready to go for the panelists. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up for audience Q&A. So I just wanted to throw out a disclaimer. So the majority of today's session will be recorded. However, in order to create an atmosphere where everyone feels comfortable speaking their mind and asking questions, during the audience question and answer period, we'll stop the recording so that all of you have the ability to feel free and ask whatever questions you feel like getting answered today. At any point, feel free to ask a question. So what you'll see is on the bottom of your control panel, you'll see a questions tab. And so during the panel, feel free to write whatever question you have, and we'll do our best to get to your question today. Unfortunately, we may not have time to get to every question, but rest assured that your questions will be answered. If we don't get to your question in today's discussion, we'll send out an email to you after our discussion with a response. So let me introduce myself. My name is Dave Mayers, and I'm an industrial organizational psychologist that works for a Toronto-based company called Knockri. My role at Knockri involves the development of assessments used for applicant screening and consulting with organizational leaders to embed selection assessments into the hiring process. My current area of focus are machine learning, automated interviews, and explainable AI. Knockri is a platform that shortlists candidates ethically and efficiently. Knockri was founded with the mission to provide every candidate with an equal and equitable opportunity for employment. Knockri assessments measure a wide range of behavioral skills required for success on the job. And without any further ado, let me introduce today's panelists. First, we have Dr. Sheri Feinzig. Sheri is the Global Head of Workforce Planning and Analytics for Marsh McLennan. She is an experienced executive with a history of successfully leading teams through a range of business challenges, transformations, and growth. She has extensive experience in human resources research, organizational change management, and business transformation. Her recent areas of focus include people analytics, diversity, equity and inclusion, artificial intelligence ethics, employee experience, and workforce planning. She is an adjunct professor for the New York University's Human Capital Analytics and Technology Master's Program. She frequently speaks on various HR-related topics and is the author of numerous publications, including the critically acclaimed workforce analytics book, The Power of People. Sheri earned her PhD in industrial organizational psychology from the University at Albany. Our next speaker, Dr. Charles Handler. So he is a thought leader, analyst, and practitioner in the talent assessment and human capital space. Dr. Handler currently serves as president of U.S. operations for Sova Assessment, a full-service assessment technology provider. Through his career, Charles has specialized in developing effective, legally defensible employee selection systems. Since 2001, he has been a driving force for innovation in talent assessment. Dr. Handler has helped companies such as Nike, Delta, Hershey's, Intuit, Wells Fargo, and many more to design, implement, and measure impactful employee selection processes. Through his prolific writing and media outlets such as ERE.net, his work as a pre-hire assessment analyst for Burson by Deloitte, his podcast Science for Hire, and worldwide public speaking, he is a highly visible futurist and evangelist for the assessment talent space. Throughout his career, Dr. Handler has been at the forefront for innovation in the talent assessment space, applying his sound foundation in psychometrics to help drive innovation and assessments using gaming, social media, big data, and other advanced technologies. Dr. Handler holds a master's in science and a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from Louisiana State University. Our next speaker is Dr. Christina Norris-Watts. Christina is the head of assessment and people practices at Johnson & Johnson. In this role, she's responsible for defining and leading the enterprise-wide selection and development assessment strategy, overseeing the organization's skill and competency strategy, and integrating this into J&J's workforce and succession planning strategy. Christina has 20 years of experience in talent assessment and talent management. She previously worked in financial services and consulting, leading the design and implementation of performance management processes, job architecture strategy, selection assessment, competency modeling, and organizational analytics solutions. Christina earned her PhD in industrial organizational psychology from the University of Argonne. All right, so now let's jump into questions. People can't see Charles, but he's here, rest assured. He's in here somewhere, so we'll have him on audio today. So, just to get us started, inclusive hiring, at least the way I understand it, is when organizations actively recognize diversity and embrace, a wide range of qualities and perspectives that candidates bring. It's about making every effort to invite diverse applicants to be part of the organization's story and to participate in that narrative. It's about making sure that anyone that might be a good fit for a job is given an equal and equitable opportunity to both apply and be considered for the job. So at a high level, that's what I think inclusive hiring is, but very curious to hear what you all think. So what I think I'm going to do is, for my first question, is ask the three of you, kind of how do we know that our hiring practices are inclusive? What are we looking for? Or perhaps, what are some of the red flags? How do we know that things are going wrong if they are? So I'll leave it up and see if we have anyone that wants to jump in.
I'll jump in without the visual cues. It's hard to see me raising my hand, so I'll just jump right in.
Sure.
And apologies, I can't be in on the camera today. We had some technical problems. So, over the years, we've done a lot in the assessment space, especially. You're asked to come in and say, hey, do we have a problem here? Let's do a study or run some numbers and look at the relationship between the tests or the measures that we're using and the outcomes. And when you're able to get demographic data, you can take a look at that. So consistently over probably 20 some years in that process, we often see things that companies probably know are going on already, where we look at just the overall demographics of the population and we say, wait a minute, there sure are a lot of people missing here from a diversity standpoint, right? So to me, you have a problem if you look at your population of people in a job and they all pretty much look the same, and there's not even enough data in the cells of analysis to give you anything to work with, right? So if you look at that, you could say, well, something's going on here systematically that's leaving this company or this section that we're looking at with no diversity. To me, it doesn't get any more clear than that.
Yeah, for sure, Charles. And I think one thing for talent acquisition teams to ask themselves in organizations is, how diverse is the talent acquisition team? If the people responsible for recruiting and creating an inclusive environment are not themselves diverse, they might not be asking the same questions that a more diverse team would ask. So I would start there in terms of kind of diagnosis and potential red flags. And then once you've got those diverse perspectives looking at the situation, there are certainly red flags to look at. You can look at the language in your job postings, for example. Is there off-putting language that would systematically exclude some people because they'll look at that and not see themselves? So just as an example, using terms like ninja warrior, which could be off-putting for some people. They might not see themselves as fitting into a role that's described that way. So just one example there. And then to your point, Charles, around just looking at the profile of the people you've got, and if you are able to start to bring some diverse candidates into the funnel, really looking across the entire acquisition funnel to see how those different groups are faring at each stage. So how many candidates, diverse candidates, are coming in and responding to your job application to begin with, and then how many make it to the screening stage and the interview stage, et cetera. So just a couple of things to be looking at in a little bit more detail there as well.
Yeah, Sheri, if I can just build on that a little bit, because I think it's really important what Charles was saying about the fairness statistics, and then you get at, and are you looking at it from the candidate's point of view? Because the original question, Dave, right, was like, how do you know if it's inclusive or not? Well, inclusive is a feeling that is felt by each individual candidate. So does the individual human being who's applied, do they feel that they're included? Do they feel they're included in the language? Do they feel that they're included in the process? Do they feel like they will be included then in this organization that they are applying for? And there's the way to do that is to first put yourself in the candidate's shoes and go through the process. What does this look like? How does this feel? And then also to ask your candidates, how did it feel? Inclusion is a feeling. There's not a legal definition, right, of inclusion the way we have for some of our other things when we talk about fairness. And so it really is, how does this individual feel? Because you can have all the best intentions and set up something that you think is so fair, and on paper it's so fair, and it can still not feel inclusive. So really getting that candidate's voice and their feeling of what it's like is so important.
That's great. And I think so, I was talking about the outcomes of the process. You all are talking about the lead-ins. Somewhere in the middle of the process too, I'll add, we've had really good luck over the years. And this was one of the most eye-opening things that's ever happened to me in my career around this subject is, our client asked us to convene an internal diversity review board. We built a screening tool, a high-volume screening tool for sales and customer service. So they said, well, we're going to get the diversity representatives from our company and a diverse group of people to look at the questions that you all wrote. Now, having been trained and, feeling pretty good about myself as far as a question writer that can write good questions that are neutral and, and all that, they came back with some just amazing feedback that I never would have thought of, but that without being in that culture and really understanding, how people outside that culture look at things, we made a lot of changes to that, and we were able to get sign off kind of internally that yes, this thing now seems really clean. I just was very surprised by that. So I think part of it is you might think that what you're putting out there is inclusive, but you better get some folks that have representation of a lot of diversity to look at what you're doing and make sure that you get their feedback on it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at, Charles. That's a great example to bring that to life. I mean, we all have our own lenses of the way we view the world, and we all have our blind spots. And that's why it's so crucial to have diverse voices making the decisions along every step of the way in the recruiting and onboarding process. And I'd also emphasize that as well in terms of an inclusive recruiting process. It doesn't end when someone accepts an offer. We really need to be thinking through what is their onboarding experience going to be? How are we setting them up for success in this environment? So yes, completely aligned with that thought of bring those diverse perspectives in, people who have different lived experiences and view the world differently, to stress test all along the process.
Yeah, that's great.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and kudos to you, Charles, for having the humility, right? Because it actually takes a lot of humility, not just from you, the question writer, but from your talent acquisition organization and maybe the leaders in your HR organization to listen to that and to say, and to not say, oh, well, I'm the best question writer, so I know how to do this. Oh, I've been doing this for 20 years. I know how to do this. But to really step back and listen to that, hear that feedback, and then change your approach based on that.
Yeah, and even thanks, and for me, we just always want the best end product for the client, but and for the individuals who to make sure they have a fair process. One of the other really interesting things, just a quick aside, that I had, again, my frame of reference, one of the people we were talking to said, as an African American, we have to work twice as hard to get half as far. Like, when you hear people telling you that, I'm like, wow, I never thought about things that way. But imagine, that perspective going into trying to get a job, going into your career, and thinking that you have so many more obstacles ahead of you than other people do. That's got to be really disconcerting. So whatever we can do to help make that not happen is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those are great perspectives coming from, how do we diagnose that there's a problem, to kind of looking at that applicant journey, figuring out what's going on, and then actually working with the way that we're communicating with candidates. I think that that's very important information, and all addresses kind of like that first question of, like, how do we know that we're doing things right? And so, I think, where I'd like to bring this, if you all agree, is that, in many cases, when we speak about diversity, we're talking about intellectual diversity. We're talking about bringing in people that have different backgrounds, making sure that we're, looking for people that might have different ways of solving problems or thinking. And so many times the best innovations come from this cross-pollination, bringing in people from all different areas and try to build high-performance teams, for example. So I think a good example of this is in the UK, where healthcare professionals learned how to improve these high-risk handoffs in the ICUs. So this is when, a patient that's in critical care has a lot of stuff going on, and so like when they're passed from one team to the next, they have to do a whole bunch of things. And so in the healthcare industry, what they did was they started borrowing strategies that were being used by Ferrari pit crews. So improving the quality of patient care by incorporating some of these procedures used in the race car industry. So my next question, and I think this really speaks to where we're headed in the economy, and say, let's say the federal government is able to soften the labor market just a little. We have a lot of these skilled employees that are coming from diverse, non-traditional backgrounds. So as a recruitment specialist or someone that's working in the area of selection assessment, how can organizations breed this type of cross-pollination and get this phenomenon from the recruitment side? So what might be some of the strategies that we can use to engage and attract talent that has some of these different industry backgrounds?
So I can jump in. So Dave, I think that's first of all, I love cross-discipline as a design point. Generally speaking, I think you're just going to get so much better problem solving by bringing those diverse perspectives in. And I think in this context, it really comes down to identifying what the core skills are that are relevant for the job that we're talking about. So in your example, clearly there was some core skill that was common in those very different scenarios. Maybe it was being able to, you said handle a million things at the same time with no time to react, like being able to make those split decisions, take in lots of input and act immediately, or whatever that core skill is. I think that's the first step, is identifying that and then focusing on that core skill that could be developed in a whole array of different contexts. And if you can find people who have that core skill in those different contexts and reach out to them, if they have people with a specific type of training and there are communities around that you can reach out to and get to those different diverse communities that have that core skill to bring that in together, and then you could get that cross-discipline magic happening.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Sheri. And in terms of actually like recruiting them, do we know, are there any strategies? Like, how do we get people with non-traditional backgrounds? How do we reach out to them? Do we, is Johnson & Johnson doing any strategies? Charles, what do you have any strategies that you think might work in this regard?
Well, I've seen some really good stuff work before. And I agree completely with Sheri about the training aspect. That's what I wrote in my notes here is, find someone who does something similar in a completely different paradigm. So I remember reading somewhere where a company, and I can't even remember what the job was, they started hiring anthropologists to look at a problem in a completely different way. And I wish I could remember what the problem was. So I think that, that's one part of it. And my other quick piece is just life experiences, right? There's a thing called experiential diversity, but it's kind of hard to tap into that at a scaled systematic level. But we could potentially get there in exactly how I'm going to answer your question, which is what I've seen from a retail client of ours. They had community ambassadors. So essentially they had individuals that are part of the recruiting team that would go to places where they felt like they would see their ideal people. That could be community, and this was an athletic company, so community athletic meets running clubs or basketball pickup games or whatever, and sometimes even find where they had structured events going and be able to set up like a little booth or something there. So they hired these community ambassadors, and their job was just to be out on the streets, basically looking for the type of people that they wanted, where those people typically are. But it's really important, and then I'll stop here. Again, what Sheri said, this applies to hiring anybody for anything. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to find it. So the very first thing is to really study what it is you're looking for, and that may extend from skills to the type of person, the background, the training, and then understanding where are those people. That's got to be the planning and foundation of this stuff for it to be successful.
Great. Yeah. And Christina?
Yeah. So just a couple things to add. I couldn't agree more on the defining the skills needed and then looking for those skills. What you asked if J&J is doing anything that's been helpful. We've had a really successful Reignite program, that's what we call it, and that's the Reignite program is focused on bringing women back into the workplace after they have left the workforce to have a family or care for a family, to really re-engage with those women and try to bring them back. That's been a nice effort we've made. Part of that does rely on the being clear, though, on the skill sets we are looking for and what skills to bring in. That experiential learning Charles was talking about, boy, you learn a lot when you have a newborn or a couple kids that you are project managing at home. There's a lot of skills that are gained in that sense. And it's really, we're seeing this even in the discussions that you hear about getting rid of college degree requirements or other degree requirements sometimes, right? And they're saying, well, we'll look at the skills. I mean, the reason we have those degree requirements is because they're easy, right? It's like, it's easy to have that as a min qual. Oh, do you have a 4-year degree or not? Yes, no, great. And then we can move forward in our hiring process. It's much harder to really identify the key skills and say, what are you looking for? Okay, you're looking for this kind of problem solving ability, this kind of logical reasoning, this kind of project management ability, and then measure that in the hiring process. Yes, it's harder, but it's more effective because then you actually get the skills you're looking for instead of the proxy where you said, oh, 4-year degree and 7 years of experience. That's just a proxy for the actual skills you are looking for. So it does take more time to set that up, but once it's set up, you're going to get a better candidate, and you're going to get candidates that are from a variety of different backgrounds that still have the skills that are necessary to be successful in the job in question.
Absolutely. That was really well put, Christina. I really like that. And Sheri, you too. Like, that's, figuring out what the skills you really need are and trying to package that. And, Charles, the outreach. So how do you get these more, non-traditional recruits? Just setting up, a booth at a pickup game, trying to entice people to kind of join the organization and to come along with that journey. So that's great. And so I think that leads very nicely into the next set of questions that I really have, and I think this one actually is more focused for Christina. But let me give you a little bit of a primer here. So there's many jobs where the war for talent still persists, right? So many organizations are actually hoarding highly skilled talent, and it seems there's just not enough applicants to satisfy the number of available openings. But there are some jobs where applicant pipelines are fairly robust. And as we head into rising interest rates and monetary policy that is intended to increase even further the number of applicants that we have, I think this is a perfect question for you, Christina. So your experience, and just speaking with you about your experience in Johnson & Johnson, that organization went from a few 100,000 resumes to now, what is it, 2 million applicants a year? Yeah, on track to hit 2 million. So how does an organization like Johnson & Johnson balance the need for both efficiency and inclusion as applicant volumes start to rise? So just very curious to know what what you'd have to say on that. You've been probably have a lot of wealth of knowledge there. So
We have a marvelously skilled talent acquisition organization that works very, very hard. It's a really interesting situation that we're in at the moment, right? Externally, where to your point, Dave, we still have jobs that we are not getting on a lot of applications for, and that we have jobs where we get sometimes tens of thousands of applications for a job. And these are global jobs, and that's why we're on track for the 2 million application number. And it is a challenge. It's a real challenge to figure out how you're going to sort through that effectively and efficiently, and how you're going to sort through that while still ensuring the candidate feels included and feel like the candidate was able to put their best foot forward. So we have a variety of solutions depending on the level of the job, right? We're talking straight out of school, or are we talking executive level, or are we talking anywhere in between? We have a variety of technologies that we use, from pre-recorded interviews to live interviews. Of course, everything back in 2020 went fully remote. Some things are back in person, but I think the most of our hiring will continue to stay remote, as that seems to be more efficient for both the people doing the interviewing and the folks being interviewed. So that's a shift that I think will stay for a while. And then it goes, like, honest to goodness, it goes back to the last answer of, well, what are the skills we're looking for, right? So early on up front, we screen out the non-negotiables. So, right, we ask about our leadership skills that we're looking for. We could call those leadership imperatives at J&J, and our Credo. That's foundational to every job at J&J. Let's look at that first. Great. Then how are we gonna assess the technical skills for this particular role? Great. Then how are we gonna assess some of the other leadership, whether they be soft or hard skills that are needed for the role? How are we gonna get those? So getting that process in place is so critical, and you can do that even for the variety of jobs that we have at J&J, right? We hire forklift operators, we hire PhD, MD researchers, right? For all of them, they still need to have Credo-aligned behavior. They need ethical decision-making, inclusion, respect for others, all those things. They need the technical skills for that job. They're gonna need some other leadership skills that's laid out. And we've laid out tools to help with the talent acquisition team and the business assess for those things. But it goes back to the skills needed on the job.
Yeah, awesome. Sheri, did you want to say something?
no, okay, yeah. So that's great. I mean, kind of laying out that pipeline and making sure that everything is getting assessed. Now, what are some of the challenges? I know you might have spoken about this previously in maybe a few conversations we were having. But what about populations with a disability? So are there any challenges that Johnson & Johnson faces, or is there anything that Johnson & Johnson is doing to address some of these challenges with populations with a disability?
Yeah, we're really spending a lot of time thinking about our populations with disabilities, both for applicants and for employees. Disabilities in the hiring process are so interesting because not all disabilities are visible, right? And candidates aren't always super excited to bring up their disabilities while they're trying to get their dream job or a new job that they want. So how do you create a safe space for them to do that? How do you make it clear who they should even mention it to? How do you make sure everyone feels comfortable if they do mention it? Because you don't know who candidates will mention it to. Will they mention it to the first recruiter? Will they mention it to the hiring manager? Will they mention it to an interviewer that they just happen to be interviewing with? And disability conversations can sometimes make people really uncomfortable or uncertain in a hiring context. So you need to make sure that anyone who's doing the interviewing knows how to respond appropriately, and knows who to go to. They don't need to have all the answers, but they need to at least know who to go to. And similarly, the candidate should always know who to go to. The candidate should always know from the very beginning of the hiring process who to reach out to if they have questions, who to reach out to if they need help, whatever they need to put their best foot forward is what they should be able to ask for. So how do you make that simple when disabilities can be as unique as the people who have them. So we're really always looking for ways to make it simple, making sure that we audit ourselves a lot, like apply to our own jobs a lot to understand when I send this email, how quickly do I get a response? When I call this number, do I get an answer that is appropriate? What does this feel like from a candidate's point of view? Because it's, again, back to that feeling, to get that feeling of inclusion. And we want all populations to feel included in the hiring process.
Right on, right on. Yeah, Charles, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think that's really great insight, and it just keeps going back to the, welcoming people and giving an inclusive, vibe, if you will, from the process, which candidate point of view, you can't ignore that. And I think it has so many more levels of depth than a lot of people might even think when they're just thinking about, a good candidate experience. In the assessment world, we think a lot about just, okay, do we need to make accommodations of some sort for someone to even complete this assessment? But it just goes well beyond that. And I feel like what I wanted to bring up, I learned about this because I had on my podcast a guest who is in charge of the neurodiversity hiring at Dell. And so they have a really, really cool program there. The interesting thing is it's a smaller program, right? It's not scaled. When you start thinking, and Dell does have 2 million applicants a year as well, but they've kind of taken a more controlled laboratory type approach, and they have a really good program where people are able to, come on if they meet any, and she had an interesting statistic on there. I can't remember the percentage, but it's something like 30% or 20% of all people have some form of thing that would be classified as neurodiversity, right? They get a chance to enter into a program where they get assigned projects and they work with, their hiring manager or whomever, just to complete a project and get a feel for how they're working and, what they can contribute. And of course, that's potentially a ramp on to the job. And I believe they have kind of like a sponsor that's assigned to them. So they have a very well scripted program that really looks out for how do we achieve higher level of neurodiversity, in our company. And again, those things are cool little laboratories. I think the biggest challenge is how do we scale that when we have so many applicants? How do we make sure we're catching those nuances and subtleties in that fire hose of applicants that people are getting bombarded with? And that is a challenge.
Yeah, I definitely see the challenge when it comes to, trying to accommodate, neurodiversity, populations with a disability, while balancing, the need for having, a standardized selection process. So it's, how do we make sure that the assessments that we're providing to these special populations are, consistent with what we would be using for different groups of applicants? And are we really assessing skills that are relevant for the job in many cases across both of these? And so I think, these are challenges that I think a lot of companies are still facing. And I think it becomes a problem at scale, right? So, in little projects it might work, but how do we get this to this, how do we get this at scale? And how do we make sure that, every recruitment team is following procedures that are going to be both inclusive, equitable, and fair for all of our candidates? And I mean, Charles, it's interesting that you mentioned that conversation that you had with the neurodiverse leader from Dell. I actually listened to that podcast, and it made me think, you have so much experience as an analyst. You talk to hundreds, of HR professionals in this space. You look at, I think what in your last report you had over 300 different assessment HR tools that you took a look at. So, I have a question. From everything that you've kind of seen out there in the recruitment space, are there any technologies that you think help drive candidate outreach or maybe, would facilitate inclusion efforts for organizations? Is there something that we can kind of look at, that we can take a look at, or, any cool software or any cool tech, or, do you think this area is still somewhat in its infancy?
Well, I think that the more technology evolves and the more we really care about it, the more we'll be able to find, evolve the solutions. I mean, I think one of the things that doesn't even necessarily take a ton of technology, but I've seen in multiple places, is just really blinding if you're going to use a resume, which, it's kind of that you have to in some ways, but I also feel like that's, where the problems, I wouldn't say where they can start, because I have a whole nother layer of that discussion. But at the end of the day, being able to blank those out to any kind of triggers or cues that would, intonate someone's backgrounds, or even where they went to school. There's things beyond just kind of the standard demographic categories. I feel like those are obviously very worthwhile. So you're just boiling it down to what skills and abilities do people have. Otherwise, everybody's trying to find good solutions, and I don't think there's any magic bullets by any means. But I just think it's about platforms that provide a venue for the overall feeling of inclusiveness, right? The warmth that you might be able to project there through various means. So there's a lot of tools now they're called candidate CRM, so candidate relationship management systems, that kind of sit on top of ATSs, and they at least make the process a little lighter and easier to apply. And I'm not saying all of those, automatically achieve inclusiveness, but what they do is give you additional color or, richness to be able to talk about what it is that you're doing as a company. I think there's a lot of tech out there that allows little video, kind of personalized video things to be part of the process. There is technology as well that, supposedly can scour the web and pull out triggers for diversity. I'm not gonna say I know that or feel that those are 100% effective. It's pretty easy to say you're doing that by scraping someone's LinkedIn profile and then saying, okay, we're gonna highlight this person as someone who you may want to pull in the name of inclusivity or whatever. Not so sure about that. I'll honestly say that I always go back to the basics. I mean, it's all just about making sure that every step of the way you're doing the things we talked about here, and there are technologies that can help with that. I don't think there's one you can switch on that says, okay, all of a sudden this is just going to do everything you need. I do think also monitoring and data analysis tools are a good thing to look at as well. Just so how are you tracking this information, and how are you organizing it and utilizing it to decision and to just kind of take the pulse of what's actually happening? Because without that, especially at a giant corporation, it's not so easy to know everything about what's going on. But the more you tie your data together and start looking for things that you can improve on, I think that's important. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. I wish I had something in my pocket that could solve it all right now. That would be great.
Yeah, don't we all? Yeah, that was a great answer, Charles. And I think you actually led right into like the follow-up question that I had here, which is actually for Sheri. So, I think we've had a lot of information about, like what inclusive hiring is, some of the strategies. But this question, I think right up your alley. So you have a ton of experience in the area of change management and data analytics. So my question is, when evaluating strategies that are used to help increase diversity, what types of data are we looking to collect? And how can we actually use this data to support our HR practices?
Right. So it's really important to collect as much demographic data as you can, first of all, because you're going to want to do your analyses by demographic group. Important things get washed out in the averages, and if you can't look at things like candidate experience, retention rates, et cetera, by demographic group, then you're going to lose a lot of important information. That, of course, is a huge challenge. I think that's one of the more challenging data points to collect, particularly on the candidate side. It's easier when employees join and they're in-house, but to the extent that you can collect information, I think companies do a fairly good job of getting pretty comprehensive gender data. In the US, reasonably okay, at least once people are in the organization, on race and ethnicity. Some of the other things we've been talking about obviously are more challenging, like disabilities that aren't visible, the neurodiversity, et cetera. think a lot of companies are, or at least some companies I'm aware of, have been using self-disclosure campaigns, self-ID campaigns to try to encourage the workforce to identify their different demographic groups or identities. And I think that can be helpful. It's really important if you do that, that you need to establish a level of trust with the employees. They need to understand why you're collecting that information, that it is never going to be used to harm them in any way, that it is being collected to better understand experience at these different levels, to be able to improve the experience and be able to establish great working experience and careers for all different groups of people. So that's fundamental with the data collection. And then we're going to want to look at things like I talked about earlier, looking across the talent acquisition funnel of how many people are coming in, making it to the screening stage, to the interview stage, to an offer. How many people, what proportion from different groups are accepting your offers? You want to be looking at things like pay equity. You want to be looking at retention rates. And importantly, I think some data points that I've seen recently that are really eye-opening. Look at those early stage retention rates. How many people are turning over in the first 6 months, in the first year? If you're losing people that quickly, and if those losses are systematic by different diversity groups, that's a big red flag. Like something is not working. Maybe you're able to attract people in, but you haven't created the inclusive environment that you need to keep them. So from a data perspective, I think those are some of the things that you want to be looking at. From an overall change management perspective, change really has to start from the top. So grassroots efforts can be very impactful, go a long way, but it needs to be complemented with the leaders' true leadership support and buy-in. So, the leaders really set the tone in an organization of what's accepted, what's rewarded. When we're talking about inclusive environments, what types of behaviors are okay and not okay, and calling those out explicitly. And even if not okay behaviors are coming from your superstar salespeople or even from your clients, being able to be that bold and committed to not tolerate things that are going to be counter to an inclusive environment, I think are really important as well. And when the workforce sees that, then that's the kind of behavior that gets modeled, and that's of employee value proposition that gets crafted for attracting people in. And we all know with Glassdoor and all the different outlets for people to express the experiences that they've had, that you want those expressions of experiences to be positive ones.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, I guess, I think there's a ton of HR professionals in here today. Like how do they get started? I know this might be for you, Sheri, but also like Charles and Christina, feel free to chime in here. For any HR professional that's motivated for change here, that sees things, that might have been collecting some of the data you talked about today, that might be doing something on the ground right now, how do they really, where should they begin, or how do they get the support that they need to actually drive some of these initiatives? It comes from leadership at the top, but what can someone in HR do to kind of try to help push the needle here?
I think telling stories is really impactful. And going back to the candidate experience, if we can collect meaningful information on candidate experience, so I'm not talking like an NPS score, but really well-crafted questions, including open-ended questions, say in a candidate experience survey, that you can analyze systematically, but get that rich contextual information, and being able to quote candidates about the experience they had and identify them by the different groups so that you can really bring it to life for our leaders, for our HR leaders, to understand what the current situation really is and what needs to be addressed and improved. I think stories can be a really powerful motivator for action.
I think that's such a good point, Sheri. So, we're all IO psychologists here, and so we love lots of data and big sample sizes. And it always strikes me that then you go and you talk to leaders, and boy, they love an N of one. They love an N of 1 story. And what's really helpful is if you can get the data and you can put that data together and you can see the themes that still come from your N of 100 or 1,000 or whatever it is, get the themes. And then you put at the top of it a quote, just one quote from one person that really summarizes that theme. That's the story. That's much easier for a person to glom onto, to understand, to think about how they want to action. And I go to because they hear this quote from this one person. I mean, I don't know if it's a human tendency. I'd love to study it someday about why we love these N of 1 stories, but there is really something to them. So don't try to fight that. Capitalize on it. You know, do your data analysis, but still use those quotes, use those N of 1 stories.
Yep.
I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, when we do our work interviewing people, we do a lot of different types for different reasons. We always put quotes in there on top of the data, and you can see visibly the happiness of the people that you're feeding this to on the other side, on the client side, seeing that, you know, the stories being told from individuals. So I feel like that is, I want to reinforce how important that is. And the other thing I'll say, which has kind of already been said, but you know, you got to audit yourself. I mean, you've got to stop and say, especially coming in from the outside, as I have for many, many years, the first thing we do is say, all right, we're going to see what's going on here. So we will apply for the job as a candidate. That's a very important thing. But it's also interviews, looking at data, looking at background materials. If you're internal as an HR professional, which is essentially what this question's about, you still need to audit what's going on. I mean, you still really, really need to understand in a discovery phase, what's the current state here. You may have a lot of anecdotes about that. You may even have a little bit of data about that, but until you take a comprehensive view and look at every system and every, you know, area that's contributing to the hiring process and even beyond, you don't really know what you're starting with. So I think that's a very important piece of the equation.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, I had one more question, but it seems like that was already kind of taken care of. And that's applicant experience surveys. So how can they be leveraged? I mean, I think what I got from this conversation so far is that's where we get our anecdotes. That's where we get that rich understanding of what applicants are experiencing. And we can use that along with our data to really kind of drive the message home that either things are going well or maybe perhaps things need to change. So awesome. Well, maybe I'll open it up a little bit if anyone has any last comments before I change it over to the next phase, which will see if we have any questions from the audience.
So are you ready to?
One comment that I'll quickly make, that could be a whole nother series of webinars even. It's very important to understand that just because you're receiving candidates in your hiring funnel, you've got to understand that bias can already have been happening even in who sees job ads. I mean, this was very eye-opening for me, but there's algorithms that you know, dictate what person, based on their history of browsing and all those other good things, actually even see a job advertisement. So think about that. We've got a whole situation where people who are qualified or interested may never even know the job exists because they're not getting that pushed in front of them. And even from there, you know, next step down the funnel, when you've got these high volume situations where you've got AI things that recruiters will say, more people like this, more people like this, less people like this, or, you know, those decisioning systems learn from what they're being fed. So if people are feeding those systems based on biases or whatever, then, you know, what comes below that is only going to be the result of bias. So a lot of times assessments get thrown under the bus for being the source of bias or whatever, but quite honestly, it's pervasive through the entire process and it compounds upon itself. So one of the things you really have to do is start looking, you know, even more broadly than the formal hiring process, and just make sure that the things you're doing, even feeding that process, even in an automated way, a lot of times, try to control that as much as you can.
Completely agree with that, Charles. And just I'll just add to address some of those issues of, are you reaching the right audiences to begin with? I fully agree. You know, don't rely on algorithms. to make those decisions for you. And yes, that is a whole other conversation that we could have in an entire webinar plus.
It is.
But to get to those different audiences, there are strategies that the audience can think about using. For example, there are specialized recruiting firms that you can partner with to go after specific populations who have expertise in going after those specific populations. And then there are organizations, professional organizations and otherwise, that you can partner with as a pipeline to get to those candidates. So neurodiversity at work, for example, we were talking about the neurodiverse populations before, women who code, the Black Society for MBAs, I'm probably getting the name not exactly right, but and NSBE, the National Black Engineering Society. So there are organizations out there that have these trained populations with the skills you need that are just ready to be tapped into. So don't rely on the algorithms for these things. Use your people to people resources and make those connections and build those networks and relationships.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it seems like some of our audience members actually feel similar and are trying to struggle with this as well. So, you know, I had this one question come in, and let me stop the recording as I promised. And I personally learned a lot. I hope everyone here did. And I'm very much looking forward to the next time I get to bring you on and talk about maybe something different next time, so who knows. But anyway, thank you so much for coming. And if you'd like to stick around, ask questions, feel free to do so. But we're going to end the webinar now. So once again, cheerio, take care, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.